Midnight. Vienna's Golden Opera House. A single scream slices the final note of Die Fledermaus. Maestro Karl von Ritter collapses across his score, a real Toledo dagger buried in his heart. One thornless red rose crushed beneath his hand. In the shadows, a jealous diva, a petulant tenor, a trembling understudy, a sweating impresario. Miss Jane Marple, summoned from an English village, watches every mask. 2 more will die before the curtain falls. Who turned champagne into blood? The answer lies in a stolen voice and a silenced witness. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Miss Jane Marple sat very upright in the chintz-covered armchair of Danemead Manor's smaller drawing-room. A cup of Earl Grey balanced on her knee, and the Afternoon Post in her lap. The fire crackled with apple wood. Outside, the November garden lay under a thin silver frost. She had been staying with her old friends, Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, for a fortnight, ostensibly to advise on the rearrangement of the herbaceous border, but chiefly because Mrs. Bantry declared that Jane's presence kept the Colonel from grumbling about his gout. The envelope that now engaged her attention was of unusually thick cream stock, the flap sealed with crimson wax impressed by a lyre. The address in a continental hand read, Fräulein Jane Marple, Danemead Manor, Much Benham, England. The postmark, Wien, had smudged slightly in transit. Mrs. Bantry, ensconced on the sofa with a piece of seed cake, watched with mild curiosity. "Another begging letter, Jane. You do attract them." Miss Marple slit the envelope with a silver opener shaped like a dagger. Inside lay a single card, heavy as a visiting card, yet larger, bordered in gold. She adjusted her spectacles. Hofoper Wien, Die Fledermaus, Gala Premiere, under the baton of Maestro Karl von Ritter. Friday, 17th November, Dress Circle, Seat A12. The management requests the honour of your presence at the midnight dress rehearsal and subsequent performance. A smaller note, handwritten on crested paper, was pinned beneath. My dear Miss Marple, my late wife often spoke of your remarkable insight into human affairs. Vienna in November is cold, but the music is warm, and certain matters here may profit from your observation. A compartment has been reserved on the Orient Express departing Victoria, Thursday at 11:15 a.m. With esteem, Karl von Ritter. Mrs. Bantry gave a little gasp. The Karl von Ritter, the conductor who quarrelled with Toscanini? Jane, you cannot possibly. I have never refused an unexpected summons, Miss Marple said tranquilly, folding the card. And I have always wished to hear Die Fledermaus in its proper setting. Colonel Bantry stumped in at that moment, red-faced from the garden. What's this about Vienna? You'll catch your death, Jane, damp as a crypt. Cold sharpens the mind, Arthur, Miss Marple replied. Besides, the maestro mentions his late wife. I wonder which wife. He has had 3, I believe. The first was a contralto who drank tincture of opium. The second, a Russian countess who vanished during the war. The third, well, one does not speak ill of the dead. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. You think there is something irregular? There is always something irregular where opera is concerned, Miss Marple said, sipping her tea. Passions run high, and the acoustics are excellent for eavesdropping. That evening she penned 3 brief notes, one to her nephew Raymond, requesting that her black velvet evening cloak be forwarded, one to the vicar of Little Paddocks, apologising for missing the Mothers' Union, and one to Messrs. Cook and Son, confirming the Orient Express reservation. She added, in her neat slanting hand, a request for a corner seat facing the engine and a hot water bottle. On Thursday morning, the village taxi deposited her at Much Benham Station. She wore her serviceable tweed coat, a sable stole, borrowed from Mrs. Bantry and smelling faintly of mothballs, and a felt hat secured by a pearl pin. In her handbag reposed a small leather notebook, a pencil, and a packet of boiled sweets. The guard, recognizing her from previous excursions, touched his cap. "Off to the continent, miss. Mind the drafts." "I always mind the drafts," Miss Marple assured him. The train to Victoria was punctual. At the terminus, a porter in a green apron conveyed her to the Simplon Orient Express, where a brass plate on the sleeping car read Wagon Litz, Compagnie Internationale. Her compartment, number 7, first class, was panelled in marquetry, the bed already turned down, a vase of hothouse violets on the writing table. A card beside them repeated the maestro's crest. As the train glided out past the gasworks and the river, Miss Marple unpacked her night things, arranged her travelling clock, and took from her handbag the opera programme that had arrived by the same post. The cast list was headed by Herr Ludwig Brandt as Eisenstein, the Countess Irina Volkova listed as patroness rather than singer. A photograph showed the maestro in white tie, baton raised, eyes fierce beneath beetling brows. Miss Marple studied the photograph for some minutes. "A man who would notice a wrong note at 50 paces, she murmured, "and perhaps a wrong motive." She drew the blind against the darkening suburbs, settled herself with a copy of the Times, and began with the gentle thoroughness of one arranging wool for knitting to consider the possible patterns of the invitation. Chapter 2. The company assembles. The Hofoper, that confection of marble and gilt, rose like a tiered wedding cake against the violet dusk of Vienna. Snowflakes drifted past the gas lamps as Miss Marple's fiacre drew up beneath the portico. A liveried porter, moustache waxed to sabre points, handed her down with the reverence due to a dowager duchess. She paid the driver in crisp shillings Mrs. Bantry had insisted on, changing a £10 note at Cook's, and mounted the grand staircase, one gloved hand lightly on the balustrade of Carrara marble. The foyer hummed with the subdued excitement that precedes a gala. Ladies in sables and tiaras rustled like autumn leaves, gentlemen in white tie compared decorations with the air of men who had survived more than one congress. A string quartet in the balcony played the overture to Die Fledermaus in waltz time, the cellist's bow flashing like a rapier. Miss Marple surrendered her cloak to a maid who might have stepped from a painting by Macquart and accepted a programme bound in gold cord. She had barely opened it when a voice at her elbow said, in precise accented English, "Fräulein Marple, the maestro begs a moment." The speaker was a slight young man with a nervous smile, and a carnation in his buttonhole, Herr Schindler, the assistant stage manager. He led her through a baize door, along a corridor smelling of resin and face powder, and into the wings. The stage beyond was a cavern of shadows and half-raised flats. A single ghost light burned on the prompt desk. From the auditorium came the muffled clink of champagne glasses. Maestro Karl von Ritter awaited her beside the prompter's box. He was shorter than his photograph suggested, but the leonine head and the eyes, dark, impatient, amused, were unmistakable. He kissed her hand with old-world courtesy. "Welcome to my little kingdom, gnädiges Fräulein. You find us in disarray. Brandt is sulking, the Countess is late, and the soprano has mislaid her high C. But come, you shall meet them all." He offered his arm. Miss Marple took it, noting the strength in the wrist that had tamed orchestras from Bayreuth to Buenos Aires. They emerged into the auditorium through the pass door. The house lights were up. The stalls were empty, save for a few critics scribbling in notebooks, and a stagehand sweeping confetti from the previous children's matinee. At the foot of the orchestra pit stood the company, posed like figures in a tableau. The maestro presented them with the flourish of a ringmaster. Countess Irina Volkova, our patroness, and once the greatest Rosalind of her generation. The Countess inclined her head. She was tall, still slender, with the bone structure that survives both time and temperament. Her gown was black velvet, cut low. A rope of pearls disappeared into the shadows of her décolletage. The eyes were Slavonic, pale grey, slightly prominent, and they rested on Miss Marple with the mild interest one accords a harmless eccentricity. "Enchanté," she murmured, the French perfect, the smile not quite reaching the eyes. "Herr Ludwig Brandt, our Eisenstein." The tenor stepped forward, clicking his heels. He was 35, perhaps, with the profile of a Roman coin and the petulance of a child denied a second helping. A diamond stud glittered in his shirt front. His cuffs were fastened with tiny gold batons. He bowed over Miss Marple's hand, but did not kiss it. "Maestro flatters me," he said. His voice was beautiful even in speech, but there was a rasp of strain beneath the velvet. "I have a cold. Vienna in November is fatal to the larynx." "Yet you sang Otello here last winter without a quiver," the Countess observed, examining a flaw in her fan. Brandt flushed. "That was February. The air was dry." Miss Marple smiled placidly. "Colds are inconvenient, Herr Brandt. My nephew Raymond swears by glycerin and honey, though I believe you prefer Slivovitz." The tenor's eyes narrowed. The maestro gave a bark of laughter. "Next, Frau Elsa Kleber, guardian of our costumes." Frau Kleber was a spare, grey-haired woman in a black alpaca dress that buttoned to the throat. Her keys, dozens of them, jangled at her waist like a jailer's. She acknowledged Miss Marple with a nod so economical it might have been a salute. "Everything must be exact," she said. "A torn flounce, a missing button, disaster. I lock the wardrobe at 11 sharp." "Very proper," Miss Marple approved. "One cannot be too careful with silk." "Signor Alberto Rossi, our impresario." Rossi was a Neapolitan of 50, plump, perspiring, with a waistcoat strained over a stomach that had sampled too many cream cakes. His handshake engulfed Miss Marple's fingers. "Carissima signorina, you honour us. Vienna without an English lady is like Tosca without the knife." "Or with the wrong knife," Miss Marple murmured. Rossi's laugh boomed. "Precisely. We have a new dagger for Act 3, Toledo steel, commissioned especially. The old one was blunted by generations of prisoners. And finally," the maestro said, "Miss Felicity Dane, understudy to Fräulein Lind, our Rosalinde, who is indisposed with laryngitis." Felicity was 22, slight, with corn-coloured hair twisted into a knot, and eyes the colour of wood violets. She wore a plain grey frock that had seen better days, but her curtsy was graceful. "I know every note," she said earnestly. "If Fräulein Lind cannot sing—" "She will sing," Brandt interrupted. "Laryngitis is the excuse for laziness." Felicity coloured. The Countess laid a gloved hand on the girl's arm. "Courage, child. The understudy's lot is gratitude and nerves." Miss Marple observed the small tableau, the Countess's possessive fingers, Felicity's quick intake of breath, Brandt's scowl, Rossi's calculating glance at the empty director's box, where a critic from the Neue Freie Presse was already sharpening his pencil. Frau Kleber consulted a pocket watch and announced that the wardrobe must be locked in 7 minutes. The maestro clapped his hands. "To work! Fräulein Marple, you shall sit in the director's box. Schindler will bring you coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz we endured in 45. He escorted her up the marble staircase to the box. From this vantage, the stage lay, spread like a chessboard. The prison set half erected, flats painted with comic perspectives of the Danube, a grand piano where the repetiteur thumped through the czardas. A single red rose, long-stemmed, thornless, lay on the harpsichord, its petals the colour of fresh blood. Miss Marple settled into the velvet chair. Schindler appeared with a silver tray, coffee in a Sèvres cup, a plate of Kipfel still warm from the oven. She thanked him, opened her notebook, and wrote in her neat slanting hand, "Countess pearls, black velvet, possessive of F. Brandt, diamond stud, petulant Slivovitz, Kleber, keys, 11 p.m. lockup. Rossi, dagger, Toledo steel, Felicity, grey dress, violet eyes, rose." Below, the orchestra tuned. The oboe gave its inevitable A. The violins scraped into unison. Maestro von Ritter mounted the podium, raised his baton, and the overture began, light, effervescent, treacherous as champagne. Miss Marple sipped her coffee and watched the players take their positions, each movement precise, each smile a mask. In the wings, Frau Kleber locked the costume room door with a decisive snap. The keyring glinted as she dropped it into her pocket. Brandt lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and exhaled towards the flies where Felicity stood alone. Score clutched to her breast like a shield. Miss Marple closed her notebook. "Human nature," she said softly to the empty box, "is much the same in Vienna as in little paddocks. Only the costumes are more expensive." Chapter 3. The Rehearsal. The midnight dress rehearsal was, by tradition, a private affair. No audience save the stagehands, a sleepy critic from the Wiener Zeitung, and Miss Marple in the director's box. The house lights had been lowered to a single working bulb above the prompt desk. The chandeliers were swathed in dust covers like sleeping swans. The air smelled of resin, candle smoke, and the faint metallic tang of the footlights. Maestro von Ritter stood at the rostrum in his shirt sleeves, cuffs rolled high, baton tucked beneath one arm like a field marshal's swagger stick. He rapped the stand twice. The orchestra, 45 players no more, settled into silence. The overture, already played twice that day, rippled forth with the crispness of new ice. Miss Marple, notebook open on the velvet rail, noted the time 11:47 p.m. On stage, the prison set was complete. Iron-barred windows painted on canvas, a deal table, 2 stools, and the harpsichord. The prop dagger lay sheathed on the table, its hilt catching the ghost light. Herr Brandt, in a dressing gown of puce silk, lounged against the flats, cigarette glowing. He had refused full costume. I saved the voice, not the tailor. But the diamond stud still flashed at his throat. The Countess Volkova sat in the stalls, third row centre, wrapped in sables despite the stuffy warmth. She turned the pages of a vocal score with long, restless fingers. Signor Rossi prowled the aisle, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief the colour of Chianti. Frau Kleber had vanished, presumably to her locked kingdom of taffeta and paste jewels. Felicity Dane was nowhere visible. The maestro lifted his baton. Act 3 began. Brandt entered as Eisenstein, singing the mock-tragic Ich stehe zu meinem Lebenslauf. His voice, though strained, carried to the back of the gods. At the line, Doch plötzlich, Stich! He seized the dagger and mimed a thrust at his own breast. The blade flashed. The orchestra gave a comic shriek of strings. Miss Marple's pencil moved. 11:52. Dagger unsheathed. Brandt, careless, nearly drops it. The scene proceeded. The jailer Frosch, played by a bass with a nose like a pickled walnut, stumbled in, keys rattling. Laughter from the wings, a stagehand stifled a yawn. The Countess closed her score with a snap and rose. "I have a headache," she announced to no one in particular. "I shall return for the gala." She swept up the aisle, sables brushing the seats. Rossi hurried after her, murmuring about super titles and the Archduke's box. The baize door swung shut behind them at 11:58. Miss Marple watched the empty aisle for a moment, then returned to the stage. Brandt was now arguing with the maestro over a ritardando. The tenor's gestures grew wider. The cigarette ash fell unheeded on the painted floor. "Mein Herr, the tempo is marked lebhaft, lively, not languishing." Von Ritter's voice cracked like a whip. "And I say the audience must feel the irony," Brandt retorted. "You conduct as if it were Götterdämmerung." The orchestra shifted uncomfortably. The first violin scraped a nervous scale. Miss Marple noted 12:01. Quarrel. Brandt's pulse visible in throat. Maestro's left hand trembles. Nerves or rage? The dispute ended abruptly when Brandt flung the dagger onto the table, clatter of steel on wood, and stalked off into the wings. The maestro signalled a 5-minute pause. Musicians stretched. The timpanist lit a pipe. From the flies came the creak of ropes. Felicity Dane descended the ladder, slow and careful, a score tucked under one arm. She reached the stage, hesitated, then approached the harpsichord. She laid a hand on the red rose, lifted it, sniffed once, and replaced it exactly. Miss Marple's pencil flew. 12:04. F touches rose. Thorn already removed by whom? The rehearsal resumed. The prison trio began. Eisenstein, Rosalinda, sung tonight by the second soprano, Fräulein Lind having kept to her bed, and Prince Orlowski. Brandt re-entered, sullen but professional. The voices wove together, champagne bright. At the climax, Champagner ist der beste Freund. The cork of an invisible bottle was mimed. The orchestra bubbled like the wine itself. Then, without warning, the lights dimmed to blackout for the scene change. A single scream, high, incredulous, unmistakably real, ripped through the music. The trio faltered. The conductor's baton froze mid-beat. The working light snapped on. Maestro von Ritter lay face down across the prompt desk, arms flung wide as if embracing the score. The Toledo dagger protruded from his back, precisely between the shoulder blades. A dark stain spread across the white shirt, slow and deliberate as ink on blotting paper. The baton had rolled beneath the cello section. The red rose lay crushed beneath one outstretched hand. For a heartbeat, the theatre was silent. Then chaos. The second violin screamed. A chair overturned. Someone shouted for a doctor. Brandt stood frozen in the prison doorway, mouth open. Felicity Dane, halfway down the ladder, clung to the ropes as if turned to salt. Signor Rossi burst through the pass door, handkerchief to his lips. Miss Marple closed her notebook. She rose, calm as a nurse in a ward, and made her way down the narrow staircase to the stage. The orchestra pit was a tangle of music stands and abandoned instruments. She reached the prompt corner as Herr Schindler, white as parchment, knelt beside the maestro. "Dead," he whispered. "The blade! It went straight to the heart." Miss Marple bent. She was remarkably supple for her years, and touched the maestro's wrist. The skin was still warm. The pulse had ceased perhaps 3 minutes earlier. She noted the angle of the dagger, upward thrust from behind and slightly to the left. A strong arm, knowledgeable. The rose petals beneath the fingers were bruised but not blooded. The thorn, she observed, had been snapped off close to the stem. Footsteps pounded in the corridor. Inspector Klaus Weber of the Sicherheitsdirektion appeared, overcoat unbuttoned, Homburg hat in hand. 2 uniformed officers followed, notebooks at the ready. The inspector's glance took in the tableau, the body, the dagger, the stunned company. "Mein Gott," he said quietly, "lock the doors. No one leaves." He knelt, examined the wound without touching it, then straightened. His eyes, pale blue, unreadable, met Miss Marple's. "Fräulein Marple, I believe. The maestro spoke of you. You will remain, if you please. We may need an English eye." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am entirely at your disposal, Inspector." Behind them, Brandt began to laugh, a high, hysterical. "The curse of the opera!" he cried. "First the dagger, now the maestro. Who will conduct tomorrow?" "Silence!" Weber snapped. The laughter choked off. Felicity slid the last rung of the ladder and stood trembling, grey dress clinging with static. Miss Marple opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote, in her small, precise hand, 12:07. Murder. Dagger from table. Substituted. Rose crushed post-mortem. Countess absent since 11:58. Brandt off stage. 12:01, 12:04. F in flies. Rossi in foyer. Kleber, where? She underlined the last name twice, then closed the book with a soft snap. The orchestra lights flickered once, as if the theatre itself drew a shuddering breath. Somewhere in the flies a rope creaked, though no one moved. Chapter 4. The Body in the Prompt Box. The Hofoper, so lately a temple of illusion, had become a morgue. The ghost light above the prompt desk burned with a sickly pallor, throwing long shadows across the maestro's outstretched arms. The blood had ceased to spread. It formed a perfect comma on the white shirt, as though punctuation had been added to a score. Inspector Weber, coat now buttoned to the throat, stood with his back to the orchestra pit, notebook open, voice clipped and precise. Names, positions, movements, from the moment the lights dimmed. Begin. The company, herded into the stalls like nervous sheep, obeyed with varying degrees of coherence. Stage hands, musicians, the sleepy critic, all were marshalled into rows. Miss Marple sat quietly in the front, hands folded over her closed notebook, eyes bright behind the spectacles. She noted the small telling details that policemen, for all their training, sometimes missed. The tremor in Signor Rossi's left eyelid, the way Frau Kleber's keys no longer jingled. She had removed them from her belt and clutched them in a gloved fist. Herr Schindler, still pale, was first to speak. The blackout was routine, 10 seconds for the scene change. I was at the switchboard, stage left. When the scream came, I threw the working light. The maestro was already like that. Time, Weber snapped. Schindler consulted a pocket watch. 12:03, perhaps 12:04. The prison trio had reached the Champagner phrase. Weber turned to Brandt. "You were on stage?" "Off," the tenor corrected. "I had exited at the end of my solo. 12:01, as the maestro's watch will show." I went to the green room for a throat spray. Alone, alone, Weber repeated, writing. And you, Fräulein Dane? Felicity, seated between two violinists, twisted a handkerchief into a rope. I was in the flies, learning the blocking for tomorrow. I came down the ladder at the scream. I saw the maestro fall forward. The dagger was already... Her voice broke. The inspector's gaze moved to Rossi. The impresario dabbed his forehead. I had followed the Countess to the foyer. She wished a headache powder. We were at the cloakroom when we heard the disturbance. The clock there read 12:05. Convenient, Weber murmured. Frau Kleber. The wardrobe mistress stepped forward, back straight as a ramrod. I locked the costume room at 11:47, as always. I then went to my office above the flies to complete the laundry list. I heard nothing until Herr Schindler hammered on the door. Weber's pen paused. Your office has a window onto the stage? A small one. I was writing. Writing, the inspector echoed. We shall see the list. Miss Marple's pencil moved silently. Kleber, office above flies, window, possible sight line to prompt box. Weber addressed the orchestra. Who was nearest the pass door? The first cello raised a tentative hand. I, Herr Inspector. I saw no one enter or leave the pit after the blackout. The double bass, emboldened, added, but the prompt box is shielded by the flats. One could approach from the wings unseen. Weber nodded. Doctor! The police surgeon, a thin man with a goatee, knelt again beside the body. He withdrew the dagger with care, wrapping it in gauze. Death instantaneous. Blade entered the heart from behind, upward thrust. Considerable force. Perpetrator taller than the victim, or standing on a slight rise. The maestro was bending forward, perhaps consulting the score, when struck. Taller, Weber repeated. He measured von Ritter's height with his eye. 5'8", perhaps 9. Brandt was 6 feet, Rossi 5'10", Frau Kleber 5'6" in her sensible heels, Felicity barely 5'3". The Countess, tall, Miss Marple added, thrust upward, maestro bending, prompt desk 3 FT high, perpetrator used step. The inspector ordered the body removed. 2 attendants lifted the maestro onto a stretcher. The crushed rose fell to the floor, petals scattering like drops of blood. Miss Marple stooped, nimble as a girl, and retrieved a single petal. It was damp, not with blood but with perfume, a tar of roses, heavy and sweet. She slipped it between the pages of her notebook. Weber noticed. Fräulein. A keepsake, she said mildly. One likes to remember. The inspector's mouth twitched, almost a smile. You will remain in Vienna, I trust. I have a return ticket for Tuesday, Miss Marple replied, but I can always change it. Murder is so untidy. The body was carried out through the pass door. The orchestra began to pack instruments with the subdued air of men dismissed from a funeral. Brandt lit another cigarette. The match flared, illuminating the pallor beneath his makeup. Felicity sat motionless, eyes fixed on the empty prompt desk. Weber conferred with his sergeant, then approached Miss Marple. The dagger. Signor Rossi mentioned a new one, Toledo steel. We shall compare it with the prop inventory. An excellent notion, Miss Marple agreed, though I fancy the substitution was made earlier. The blade on the table during the trio was bright, newly polished. The original prop, I observed at rehearsal, had a nick near the hilt. Weber's brows rose. You noticed that? One notices small things, Miss Marple said. They are often the only true ones. The inspector escorted her to the foyer. The chandeliers were uncovered now, blazing with electric light that seemed garish after the ghost glow. The critic from the Wiener Zeitung was dictating to a telephone operator, "Maestro von Ritter stabbed. Midnight rehearsal. Police seal theatre." His voice faded as they passed. At the cloakroom, the Countess's sable cloak still hung, untouched. The attendant, a girl with frightened eyes, handed Miss Marple her own tweed coat. "The Countess?" Miss Marple asked. "Left with Signor Rossi, gnädiges Fräulein. They took a fiacre to the Hotel Sacker." Miss Marple thanked her. Outside, the snow had ceased. The Ringstrasse lay white and silent under the gas lamps. A police car idled at the curb, its engine ticking as it cooled. Weber handed her in. "I shall require statements tomorrow," he said. "Hotel Imperial, yes? Good. And Fräulein, your observations are welcome." The car purred away. Miss Marple watched the opera house recede, its facade now dark save for the police lanterns at the stage door. She opened her notebook to the petal and wrote beneath it, "Attar of roses, Countess's scent, or another's." At the hotel, the night porter bowed low. Her room, booked she discovered by the maestro himself, was on the second floor, overlooking the Kartner Ring. A fire burned in the grate. On the writing desk lay a telegram. "Deeply shocked, stop, Raymond." She smiled faintly, removed her hat, and sat down to transcribe her notes in full. The clock on the mantel struck 1. Somewhere in the city, a church bell answered. Miss Marple poured a glass of water from the carafe, added a pinch of bicarbonate. She believed in preventing indigestion, and began. Chapter 5. Motives in C-sharp. Morning in Vienna arrived wrapped in pearl-grey fog. From her window at the Hotel Imperial, Miss Marple watched the fiacres clip-clop along the ring, their lamps still burning though it was past 9. A boy in a green apron scattered salt on the pavement. Steam rose from the coffee-house opposite like incense. She finished her roll and apricot jam, folded the Times, 3 days old but adequate, and descended to the lobby. Inspector Weber awaited her beside a potted palm, Homburg in hand. "Guten Morgen, Fräulein. The opera house is sealed, but I have arranged a private salon. The company will attend at 11. "Excellent," Miss Marple said. "One thinks more clearly without an orchestra tuning." The salon was a small, stuffy room behind the stage, smelling of beeswax and yesterday's cigars. A long table had been laid with coffee, kipfel, and a silver samovar. Portraits of dead composers, Gluck, Mozart, Johann Strauss, stared down with varying degrees of disapproval. They arrived singly or in pairs, eyes red-rimmed, voices hushed. Brandt came first, muffled in a fur collar despite the stove's heat. He refused coffee and lit a cigarette with fingers that shook. "Will the gala be cancelled?" he demanded. "My contract specifies payment, whether I sing or not." Weber's reply was lost as the Countess swept in, black veil to her chin, pearls glimmering like frost. She accepted coffee, but touched neither sugar nor cream. "Karl would have wished the performance to proceed," she declared. "Art transcends mortality." Rossi followed, dabbing cologne at his temples. "The Archduke has confirmed his box. To cancel would be catastrophic." Frau Kleber entered. Last, a ledger under one arm, keys once more at her waist. Felicity Dane trailed her like a nervous spaniel. Grey dress exchanged for navy serge, a small cameo at the throat. Weber opened his notebook. Alibis, let us be precise. He began with the Countess. At 11:58 I left the auditorium. Signor Rossi accompanied me to the cloakroom. We spoke to the attendant, Fräulein Huber, about my headache powder. The foyer clock struck 12 as we stepped outside. A fiacre took us to the Sacca. The hall porter logged us at 12:09. Rossi corroborated, producing a receipt for 2 hot chocolates timed 12:12. Brandt was next. I left the stage at 12:01. I went to the green room, door opposite the prompt corner. I sprayed my throat. Here is the bottle. He tossed a small atomizer onto the table. I heard nothing until the scream. Weber sniffed the bottle. Eucalyptus and menthol. You were alone. Completely. Frau Kleber opened her ledger. I locked the costume room at 11:47. Here is the entry. I climbed to my office, stairs behind the flies. I wrote the laundry list. At 12:03, I heard a thud, then the scream. I descended immediately. She slid the ledger across. The page was headed Wäscherei, laundry. Items listed in violet ink. 12 lace jabots, 8 pairs white gloves, 1 puce dressing gown, Brandt's. The final entry, 1 red rose, petals crushed, had been added later, the ink darker. Miss Marple leaned forward. You noticed the rose, Frau Kleber? It was on the harpsichord when I passed at 11:50. By morning, it lay on the floor. Someone trod on it. Felicity's turn. She spoke so softly, Weber asked her to repeat. I was in the flies from 11:45. I watched the trio. When the lights dimmed, I started down the ladder, slowly, because of my shoes. I reached the stage as the maestro fell. Weber's pen scratched. Did you see anyone approach the prompt box? Felicity hesitated. A shadow, tall, moving fast, behind the prison flat. The room stilled. Brandt crushed his cigarette. The Countess's veil trembled. Weber closed the notebook. Thank you. You are free until 4. Statements to be signed. Fräulein Marple, a word. The others filed out. Rossi could be heard in the corridor. We must find a new conductor. Hager, perhaps, from Graz. Weber waited until the door shut. Your observations? Miss Marple opened her own notebook. The rose was left for the maestro. Thorn removed so the sender's fingers would not bleed. The card, I believe, read for K, who stole my voice. The handwriting matches Frau Kleber's laundry list. Violet ink, backward slope in E. Weber's eyes narrowed. Kleber, or someone using her ink, but consider, the Countess sang Rosalinda here in 1908. A critic wrote that von Ritter conducted her into silence. She lost her high C after a quarrel. She never sang again. And the dagger? Substituted between 11:47, when Frau Kleber locked the costume room, and 11:52, when Brandt unsheathed it on stage. Only 6 people had access to the wings. Weber ticked them off. Brandt, Rossi, Schindler, Kleber, Felicity, the maestro himself. 7, Miss Marple corrected gently. The Countess returned. Weber stared. She left at 11:58. Through the foyer. But there is a side door, stage left, used by the chorus. It leads to the alley. No attendant after 11. The inspector reached for his hat. We search her rooms. They took a police car to the Sacca. The manager, obsequious, produced the key to Suite 12. The sitting room was scented with attar of roses. A score lay open on the piano. Die Fledermaus, page 47. The high C in the Xardus, heavily inked. A marginal note. He promised to cut this. He lied. In the bedroom, they found a small velvet box. Inside, a single red thorn, dried but intact. Weber's face was grim. Enough for an arrest. Not yet, Miss Marple said. 1 more death is needed to complete the pattern. As if in answer, the telephone rang. The manager answered, paled, handed the receiver to Weber. Ja, whoa, Gott in Himmel. He replaced the receiver. Felicity Dane, found hanging in the flies, silk scarf, apparent suicide. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were very bright. "Come, Inspector, the second act is about to begin." They drove through streets now thronged with afternoon shoppers. At the Opera House, a small crowd had gathered. Photographers' bulbs flashed like summer lightning. Weber pushed through. The flies were a cathedral of ropes and canvas. Felicity's body swung gently, toes 6 inches above the trapdoor. The scarf, pale blue silk, embroidered with tiny violets, was knotted to a fly rail. Her face was tranquil, eyes closed, as though asleep. The police surgeon climbed a ladder, felt for pulse, shook his head. "Dead 2 hours, no struggle, not tied by someone who knew stage rigging, left-handed slipknot." Miss Marple looked up. High above, a small window, Frau Kleber's office, glinted in the gloom. Weber followed her gaze. Kleber again. Or the person who used her window. A constable handed Weber a note, found pinned to the girl's dress. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blue. Miss Marple examined it. Written under duress. See the pressure on the F. The pen nearly tore the paper. And the scarf? She reached up, touched the knot. Silk is strong, but this was twisted twice. A man's strength, or a woman's rage. Weber ordered the body lowered. As the ropes creaked, something fluttered down. A single red petal, caught in the scarf's fringe. Miss Marple caught it. "From the maestro's rose! The murderer keeps souvenirs." She looked round the circle of pale faces. Brandt chain-smoking, Rossi mopping his brow, Frau Kleber rigid, the Countess. Where was the Countess? "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "find Irina Volkova, before she silences anyone else." Chapter 6. The Second Death. The Opera House, sealed since dawn, had the stillness of a tomb. Police lanterns cast pools of yellow on the dusty boards. Every creak of rope or settling flat sounded like a footstep. Miss Marple stood beneath the fly rail where Felicity Dane had hung, her gaze travelling upward to the small office window, then downward to the chalk outline where the maestro had fallen. Inspector Weber, coat unbuttoned, directed his men with curt gestures. The Countess had not been found at the Sacker, nor at her apartment in the Josefstadt. Her maid swore she had left at noon to walk by the Danube. "Walk?" Weber repeated. "In this fog?" A constable approached with a folded paper. "Found in Fräulein Dane's dressing room, Herr Inspector, under the looking-glass." Weber unfolded it. A single sheet, torn from a score. Die Fledermaus, Act 2, the Czardas. In the margin, violet ink, he promised to cut the high C. He lied, now I cut him. Below, in the same hand, the girl saw. She must not speak. Miss Marple read over Weber's shoulder. "The Countess's writing. The ink matches Frau Kleber's ledger." Weber's jaw tightened. "We search every corner." They began in the costume room. Frau Kleber unlocked the door with trembling fingers. Ranks of gowns, crimson, emerald, gold, swayed gently in the draught. On a centre table lay the prop dagger's sheath, empty. Beside it, a scrap of black velvet and a reel of crimson silk thread. "Someone mended a tear," Kleber said. "I noticed this morning. The Countess's cloak, here." She lifted a sable garment from a hanger. A slit, 2 inches long, had been neatly stitched with the crimson thread. Miss Marple examined the repair. "Done in haste. The stitches are uneven, and see, blood, a single spot, on the lining." Weber bagged the cloak. "She wore this last night." Kleber nodded. "She collected it at 11:30. Returned it at 7 this morning, folded in brown paper, said she had spilled wine." They moved to the flies. A constable pointed to the ladder Felicity had descended. Halfway up, A fresh scratch marred the paint, narrow, deep, the width of a stiletto heel. "Someone climbed after her," Weber said, "or before." Miss Marple looked at the scarf, now laid on a trestle table. The embroidered violets were Felicity's own work. She had shown them to Miss Marple only yesterday, proud of the tiny French knots. The silk was twisted twice, the knot pulled tight with force. A faint perfume clung to it. Attar of roses, overlaid with something sharper, fear. Weber's sergeant entered, breathless. The Countess's Fiacre driver, Herr Inspector. He took her to the Prater at 1 o'clock. She paid him double to wait, then walked into the fog towards the Riesenrad. Alone. The Prater in November was a skeleton park. The big wheel idle, the booths shuttered, the chestnut cellars gone. Snow lay in drifts between the plane trees. Weber's car skidded to a halt at the entrance. Lanterns bobbed ahead. 2 constables had found footprints leading to the wheel. They followed. The prints were small, high-heeled, widely spaced, someone running. At the wheel's base, they stopped. A single glove, black kid, lay in the snow. Inside, stitched in gold, IV. Weber swore softly. "She's inside." The Riesenrad's cars hung like cages. The lowest swayed gently. The door stood ajar. They climbed the iron stairs. Inside the car, the Countess sat very straight, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed. A small pearl-handled revolver lay on the seat beside her. A crimson stain spread across the black velvet at her throat, not blood, but the crushed petals of a rose, forced into the wound like a grotesque brooch. Weber knelt. "Dead 2 hours. Self-inflicted." Miss Marple bent closer. The wound was a single thrust, upward beneath the chin. The rose had been rammed in post-mortem, petals adhered with congealed blood. On the floor lay a note, pinned by the revolver. I took his voice. He took mine. The girl knew. Now silence. The handwriting matched the others. Weber's face was grim. "Suicide. Case closed." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector, murder, and the murderer is still among us." She pointed to the revolver. The Countess was right-handed. See the ink on her fingers. The wound is on the left side of the throat. Impossible for self-infliction. And the rose, forced in with the left hand. Someone held her stabbed, arranged the scene. Weber stared. But the note, written earlier, perhaps under duress, or forged, "We must return to the opera house." They drove back through streets now dark. The Hofopper's facade loomed, windows blind. Inside, the company had reassembled in the salon, Brandt pacing, Rossi drinking schnapps, Frau Kleber polishing her keys with a handkerchief. Felicity's body had been removed. Only the chalk marks remained. Weber entered like a storm. "The Countess is dead, murdered. Who was with her this afternoon?" Silence. Then Rossi. "She telephoned me at 2. Said she wished to discuss the gala. I was at the Café Central." Brandt. "Rehearsing with the pianist. Ask him." Kleber. "In the wardrobe, mending." Miss Marple's voice cut through, soft but clear. "Frau Kleber, you locked the costume room at 11:47 last night. Yet the sheath for the real dagger was empty this morning. You noticed the repair to the Countess's cloak. Did you also notice that the crimson thread came from your own drawer?" Kleber's hand went to her throat. I keep all threads locked." Yet someone used it, and someone climbed the ladder after Felicity, using the scratch as a marker. Someone who knew the flies, the ropes, the strength of silk. She turned to Weber. "Inspector, arrest Signor Rossi." Rossi started up, glass crashing. "This is madness," Miss Marple continued, inexorable. "You followed the Countess to the Prater. You stabbed her with the same dagger, wrapped in her cloak to hide the blood. You forced the rose into the wound as a signature, thinking to implicate her. You wrote the note in violet ink, stolen from Frau Kleber's ledger. You silenced Felicity because she saw you substitute the dagger. You quarrelled with the maestro over money. He discovered you were selling scores to Berlin. The Countess knew, threatened exposure. 2 birds, 1 stone. Rossi lunged for the door. Weber's men seized him. In his pocket, a reel of crimson thread, a thornless red rose, and a key, duplicate of Frau Kleber's master. The impresario sagged. He promised me a fortune for the scores. When he reneged, He shrugged, theatrical even in defeat. Weber snapped on cuffs. Alberto Rossi, you are under arrest for the murders of Karl von Ritter, Felicity Dane, and Irina Volkova. As he was led away, Miss Marple picked up the fallen rose. People are very much the same everywhere, she said quietly. Greed, fear, a little stagecraft, and the curtain falls. Outside, snow began again, soft and silencing. The opera house lights dimmed one by one. Tomorrow, Die Fledermaus would play to a full house, conducted by a stranger from Graz. But tonight, the prompt box was empty and the score forever unmarked. Chapter 7. Curtain. The gala performance of Die Fledermaus began at 8 o'clock sharp. The house packed to the gods despite the morning's headlines. The Archduke occupied his box, diamonds flashing. The critics sharpened their pencils with renewed zeal. In the orchestra pit, Herr Heger from Graz raised a borrowed baton, his face pale but determined. The overture sparkled. The audience laughed in all of the right places, and no one in the stall suspected that the prompt desk still bore a faint rust-coloured comma beneath a fresh sheet of score. Miss Marple sat in the director's box, a programme open on her lap, though she had no need of it. She wore her black velvet cloak and the pearl pin. Her notebook lay closed beside a single red rose, thorn intact this time, sent up by Inspector Weber with a card, with gratitude from the Vienna police. At the first interval, the inspector joined her, hat in hand. Rossi has confessed everything. The scores were to go to a collector in Berlin, 10,000 marks. Von Ritter discovered the forgery marks on the manuscripts. The Countess threatened to expose both unless she received a share. Felicity overheard Rossi and the Countess quarrelling in the flies at noon yesterday. He silenced her with the scarf, left-handed, as you said, then staged the suicide. And the Countess? Followed to the Prater. He used her own cloak to hide the dagger, stabbed her beneath the chin, forced the rose in as a flourish. He thought 3 deaths would tangle the motive beyond untangling. Miss Marple inclined her head. Greed wears many masks, Inspector. In little paddocks, we call it wanting jam on both sides. Weber smiled faintly. You will stay for the finale. I have always liked a tidy ending. The second act began. Brandt, voice restored by terror or triumph, sang Eisenstein with reckless brilliance. The prison scene arrived. The new prop dagger, blunted, painted wood, flashed harmlessly. The audience roared at the mistaken identities, unaware that the real blade reposed in a police envelope. At the final trio, the house lights rose. The Archduke applauded. Bouquets rained onto the stage. Miss Marple closed her programme. Weber escorted her down the marble staircase. In the foyer, the company mingled with patrons, champagne flowing like the Danube in spring. Frau Kleber, keys jangling once more, accepted a glass with solemn dignity. Brandt bowed to a dowager, diamond stud winking. At the cloakroom, Miss Marple collected her tweed coat. Weber handed her into a fiacre. "You return tomorrow?" "The Orient Express leaves at 11:15, she said. "I have promised Mrs. Bantry a full account and a box of sachatorta." The horse clopped away through the snowy ring. Miss Marple watched the opera house recede, its windows ablaze. She opened her notebook to the last page and wrote in her neat slanting hand, "Case closed. Motive, greed, means stagecraft. Moral, even in Vienna, the villain takes a bow, until the curtain falls." She closed the book, drew the sable stole, returned by the police, about her shoulders, and smiled at the passing lights. Somewhere a church bell tolled 11. The snow continued to fall, soft and obliterating, covering the footprints of murder with the innocence of winter. In the morning she would be gone, and the Hofoper would sing again. But tonight, for one quiet English lady, the final chord had sounded true.